Today, we're going to follow James and Diep through a storm that will change everything. A moment where James risks his life to protect Diep, and love is revealed in the most painful, unforgettable way. But just when their fragile happiness begins to feel real, someone dangerous is already watching from the shadows. The sky had been clear just moments ago, but in the blink of an eye, everything changed. A heavy gray darkness rolled across the fields, swallowing the late afternoon light. The wind came first as a low growl, then rose into a furious howl that tore through the little garden like it had come looking for something to destroy. The loofah trellis creaked and bent. The roof of the old wooden shack shuddered as if it might be ripped away at any second. Diep had no time to think. The moment she saw the seedlings being battered by the wind, she ran straight into the storm. Her shirt clung to her skin, rain and dust lashing against her face, but all she could think about were the tiny green shoots she had spent weeks caring for. Those little plants were more than crops. They were hope. They were proof of every morning she had woken before sunrise to water, tend, and believe. "Diep!" Mrs. Huyen's voice cut through the roar of the wind, sharp with panic. But Diep was already there, crouching low, trying to shield the seedlings with her own body. Her fingers dug into the soaked earth as she tried to steady the fragile rose. Around her, the trellis groaned again. The shack let out a violent crack. One of the heavy wooden beams, loosened by the storm, shifted high above and then dropped. It happened so fast the world seemed to freeze. Mrs. Huyen saw it first. A scream tore out of her. "Diep!" Diep turned at the sound, but her foot slipped in the mud. She fell hard, one hand sinking into the wet ground as the wind pushed against her. For one terrifying second, she could only stare upward, eyes wide, as the beam came crashing down toward her. Mud splashed across her cheek. Her body trembled. The storm was everywhere, inside her ears, inside her chest, inside her fear. And in that instant, everything she had built with her own hands looked like it was about to disappear. All the effort, all the waiting, all the quiet endurance, gone in one blow. Before anyone could even breathe, James moved. He didn't hesitate. He didn't shout. He just ran. He came at the falling beam with the kind of instinct that doesn't come from logic, only from love. In 2 long strides, he threw himself over Diep, turning his body into a shield. The beam slammed into his shoulder with a sickening thud that seemed to echo through the whole yard. Mrs. Huyen froze where she stood. Diep gasped, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't even understand what had happened. All she knew was that the crushing impact meant for her had landed on him instead. James's face tightened instantly. Pain shot through his body, sharp and brutal, but he didn't back away. His jaw clenched so hard it looked like his teeth might crack. Rain poured down his face, mixing with sweat. The muscles in his neck and arms tensed as he forced himself to stay upright. The beam hadn't fully fallen. One end was jammed against a swaying support pillar that looked ready to collapse. James raised both hands and grabbed it. Bare hands. The wood was rough, splintered, soaked, and unstable. Sharp fragments drove into his palms immediately, but he held on anyway. His hands began to bleed, thin red streaks mixing with rainwater and running down his wrists. The wind kept pushing. The post kept shaking. His injured shoulder trembled under the weight, but still he stood there, refusing to let the structure cave in on Diep. Diep tried to get up, panic flooding her whole body. "James!" But he turned toward her, pain burning in his eyes, and shouted over the storm, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." It wasn't polished, it wasn't elegant. It was rough, strained, almost animal-like in its urgency. But it hit harder than anything else in that moment, because he meant it. Mrs. Huyen stared at her son as if she were seeing someone she had never truly known before. This was not the man in expensive suits, not the polished businessman people admired from afar. This was something far more real. A man standing in the rain, bleeding and shaking, using his own body to protect the woman he loved in the tiny place they had built together. Diep pushed herself up from the mud, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. Her hands shook as she reached for him, desperate to help, desperate to hold him, desperate to stop the world from hurting him any further. But even then, James kept his attention on the collapsing structure, forcing his body to hold steady against the storm. And in that violent moment, when the sky threatened to tear everything apart, the truth of what existed between them became impossible to deny. This was love tested by wind, pain, and sacrifice, and it was only just beginning. By the time the storm finally passed, the world around them looked almost unrecognizable. The rain had stopped, but everything was left dripping, broken, and scattered. The garden was a mess of bent trellises, torn leaves, and muddy footprints. Pieces of wood lay across the yard like the remains of a battle. Water still fell from the edge of the shack's roof in a slow rhythm. The air smelled of wet earth and splintered timber, as if the land itself had been shaken awake. For a while, no one spoke. Diep stood in silence, her face streaked with mud and tears, staring at the wreckage of the little place she had poured so much of herself into. Mrs. Hyan stayed close, still pale from fear, and James, despite the pain in his shoulder and the cuts across his palms, did something neither of them expected. He began to rebuild. His hands were already wrapped in rough bandages. Every movement clearly hurt, but he said nothing. He crouched beside the broken boards and started sorting through what could still be used. He moved slowly, carefully, as though refusing to let the storm have the final word. Diep stared at him. "James, what are you doing?" He looked up and gave her a faint smile. "If the wind can break it," he said, "then I can build it again." Board by board, he pieced something together in the clearing beside the shack. Diep and Mrs. Hyan moved closer, watching in silence. He wasn't fixing the roof or the fence, he was making a swing. Using the broken wood left behind by the storm, James shaped and tied each piece carefully, turning wreckage into something gentle. He tested the frame, adjusted the ropes, reinforced the seat, then stepped back. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Then he walked to the edge of the field and came back with a handful of small purple wildflowers. He tied them along the sides of the swing, decorating the rough wood with quiet tenderness. Diep's eyes filled again. Mrs. Hyan looked at her son for a long moment, and her fear slowly turned into pride. She was no longer looking at a man hiding behind status or appearances. She was looking at a man who had learned what love truly meant. Not possession, not image. Love that protects, love that repairs, love that stays. Without a word, Mrs. Hyan stepped toward Diep and took her hand. In her other hand was an old jade bracelet, smooth and pale green, clearly something precious that had been kept for years. She looked into Diep's eyes and spoke softly. "I entrust James to you," she said. "Thank you for teaching him how to love." That was all it took. Diep burst into tears. She stepped forward and embraced Mrs. Hyan tightly, overwhelmed by everything the day had nearly destroyed and everything it had unexpectedly revealed. A moment later, James joined them, and for a brief stretch of time, the three of them stood together among the broken pieces, holding one another like family. No glamour, no wealth, no masks, only tired bodies, aching hands, and hearts laid bare. When the swing was finally hung beside the garden, James motioned for Diep to sit. Mrs. Hyan sat beside her, and James took the place next to them. The swing moved gently as the evening light returned. The scent of wet soil rose around them, mixed with the faint sweetness of the purple flowers. And in that simple moment, the meaning of home settled over them. Not as a building, not as something money could buy, but as the feeling of being chosen, protected, and loved without disguise. Voiceover. Money can build a castle, but only sacrifice and sincerity can build a home. And for those who still want to tear them apart, be careful what kind of love you challenge. Far beyond the field, a figure stood in silence. John. His face was mostly hidden in shadow, but the curve of his mouth was visible. Slow, cold, sinister. The storm was over, but the real threat was only beginning.
Sau cơn bão dữ dội bất ngờ ập đến, khu vườn nhỏ của Diệp gần như bị tàn phá. Khi một thanh xà gỗ rơi xuống đe dọa mạng sống của cô, James lập tức lao tới che chắn, dùng chính cơ thể của mình để đỡ cứu va chạm nguy hiểm. Bất chấp vai bị thương và bàn tay vướng máu, anh vẫn cố giữ cước đúc không thật xuống, khiến Diệp và Huyền vô cùng xúc động. Khi cơn bão đi qua, thay vì than vãn trước đống đổ nát, James bắt đầu lặng lẽ xây dựng lại mọi thứ từ những mảnh gỗ vỡ. Thậm chí còn là một chiếc xích đu đơn giản tặng Diệp. Chứng kiến tình yêu chân thành ấy, bà Huyền trao cho Diệp chiếc vòng ngọc gia truyền dấu hiệu chấp nhận cô là gia đình. Ba người ngồi bên nhau giữa khu vườn ước mơ, cảm nhận ý nghĩa thực sự của mái ấm. Trong khi ở xa, John vẫn đang âm thầm quan sát âm mưu đen tối.